about brain-computer interfaces and how they work? Well, I'm going to tell you a little bit about them, so I'll give you a little bit of a crash course in brain-computer interfaces, and then I'll talk about some applications that we've been working on. So a brain-computer interface normally involves wearing a hat. We focus non-invasively, so we don't measure any signals inside the brain. We're always measuring signals outside the brain. And normally we get people to imagine movements or perform some mental task, and that modulates brain activity, and then we translate that into a control signal. So how do we do that? So we use a thing called motor imagery. When we measure EEG, we get a signal that looks like this. So it's a squiggly signal, but that signal is made up of different frequency components. So EEG's got this squiggly signal, but it is made up of certain frequency components that we can try to measure and then translate that into control signals. So if you think about this wave here, which is a beta rhythm, it's a fast component, and this one is a slower component. So whenever you're doing no movement, you'll see a lot of the slow activity in the motor area. That's the movement-related area of the brain. Whenever I perform a movement, such as lifting weight, I'll see that change on the opposite side of the movement, and vice versa. So I can start to detect which movement a person is performing just by looking at the squiggly signals. And if you do the movement, you can change the signals, but if you imagine the movement, you can also change the signals. So that's important. Brain-computer interfaces enable movement-independent communication. So just imagining movement, you can change your brain activity, and then we can translate that into control signal. So the motor cortex is split up like this. So your tongue is here, hands here, feet here. So you know where to look for these signals and when they're going to change. And so there's a lot of reasons why we use this as a signal in brain-computer interfaces. It's very well defined spatially, where things change, spectrally, what the frequencies and signals look like. And it's a skill that you can learn just as a child when you learn to grasp a toy. You can learn to modulate your brain activity to control a brain-computer interface. And then we use a lot of signal processing, which I'll not say too much about, right? But basically what we have is, whenever we do imagine movement, we get a signal that goes up like this for left arm movement and down like this for right arm movement. And that normally happens over a 2 to 3 second period. And so this is an example of a brain-computer interface in action. So here we've got 32 channels of the squiggly signals, the EEG, electroencephalogram, your brain waves. And this is the control signal here going from -1 to 1. That's connected to this character. So whenever the person imagines left arm movement, they move the character to the left, and right arm movement, they move it to the right. And they have to collect these little lights coming up the axons here, and they get points for doing that. So the game actually motivates the person to do it. But if I put yes here and no here, essentially I could answer questions just by imagining the movement with the brain-computer interface. Of a brain-computer interface game. Again, here you're imagining left arm movement to move this bar up, right arm movement to move this bar up, and then you can select different commands in the game. So it can be a little bit entertaining as well, but importantly, the games are used to engage the person over time. I'm not going to spend long on this slide because it's quite complicated, but we normally measure accuracy by looking at how many lefts and rights can we distinguish just by looking at the brain activity. And we normally look at the percentage then. So if I do 100 or 50 lefts, 50 rights, and I get 70 of those right, detecting, it'll be 70% accuracy. 50% is kind of random. So if you flip the coin, you would get 50% of the time correct. So with brain-computer interface, we want to get up above 70% accuracy to show that it is functional for that person. And typically, if I put a headset on any one of you today now, you might hit around 60-70% accuracy in your first go. But if I do it tomorrow and you're playing the game, you'll start to learn the strategy. And over time, you get better and better at controlling a brain-computer interface. And that's our focus when we train people. We want to get the accuracy up so that they could use it for something functional like communication or controlling a robotic device. So we also use auditory feedback. The importance of the games is you're given visual feedback. When you learn to grasp a toy as a child, if you didn't see the toy and you didn't have tactile sensation, then you would not learn how to grasp it. It's the same with brain-computer interface. If you don't see something happening, or hear something happening in response to your imagined movement, then you will not be able to learn. So the feedback is very important, and we use this type of feedback for people who can't see, or people who are not sure if they can see or not, if they've got a severe brain injury. And there's a lot of people that brain-computer interfaces have been associated with in terms of the benefits that they can provide, and I'm going to talk a few now. And the first one is spinal cord injury. So with spinal injury, we have lots of movement, or lots of ability to communicate and so on. So brain-computer interfaces don't necessarily give huge advantages, but we had a group of spinal injury participants, and we took them to this competition called Cybathlon. And at Cybathlon, people race in virtual races where they try to control their the race using their brainwaves alone. I'll just put these playing here. So basically, in the race in previous years, you have to control this car going down a track, and to do left, you have to imagine left arm movement. To do right arm movement. You also have to turn on the lights in the car, and you have to do nothing when you didn't want to do control. So it was quite difficult. But there's other races at this competition, including the functional electrical stimulation bike race, the powered wheelchair race, the prosthetic limb race. So we came third in Austria in 2019. In 2024, they changed this, so they made it even more difficult. So you have to control a wheelchair through a virtual environment. You have to move a coffee cup or an ice cube cup into an ice cube dispenser, a key into a keyhole, and a menu system. So they made it really difficult, but we had to train our pilot, our spinal injured pilot, to be able to control his brain activity to do these tasks. And this is Owen here. We won in the Cybathlon challenges this year. And the important thing is that Owen, he had a spinal injury over 25 years ago. He was very sporting before he had his injury. Didn't think he was going to compete with anybody at any point in the future. And then he was able to compete in this competition and go around the world. So a lot of impact. This is a couple of kids asking for his autograph at the competition. So Owen had a really good experience, and we contributed to our research as well, which was really important. So I've been talking about left versus right, but what if we could decode three-dimensional movements? So we get people to point in different directions, then we ask them to imagine pointing in different directions, and this is kind of the trajectory of the pointing. And so the idea here is that if you had a prosthetic arm, could you control it just by doing imagined movements? So the arm would move in the direction that you wanted to. So this is not easy. So we compared two different scenarios where a person would get feedback on the screen. So you have this silly looking arm that's on the 2D screen. It doesn't look very natural. And then you've got a VR headset, so you see the arm coming from your own body, and it gives you that sense of embodiment when you're getting feedback. And the feedback, again, is very important to learn how to control the brain-computer interface. And so what we showed was that we were able to decode three-dimensional movement from the brain activity alone, and that the VR scenario provides much better feedback than the 2D screen. So putting an EEG headset on and using VR is much better. So this idea of embodiment when you're learning to control brain-computer interfaces is quite important. When you learned to control your hand as a child, you weren't looking at a hand on a screen, you weren't looking at somebody else's hand, you were looking at your own hand. So we want to try and do the same with brain-computer interfaces. And there's loads of scenarios where you could have virtual hands in VR, so we've checked that. You could have an exoskeleton on your hand to move the hand for you. You could have functional electrical stimulation, where you've got electrical stimulation on the arm, or you could have a prosthetic. And all these things can give you feedback. All these things are being used for people with amputees, but also for people who've had a stroke, where you can ask the person to engage the brain. And a physio normally moves the hand in a stroke rehabilitation. And people only have a limited access to physios and so on. But if you repetitively engage your brain after a stroke, you can regain that function. And the more you engage, the more likelihood you are going to regain the function. So it's quite important. And so we can hook brain-computer interfaces up to robotic devices. Just get this playing. So this is a lower limb exoskeleton where the brain-computer interface is here. The person has to initiate the steps by imagining movement, and then the step happens. Same with an upper limb exoskeleton. The person has to engage the brain first, and then engage the technology as moves the hand. So this is very important, because if a physio is there moving your arm, the person could be daydreaming, maybe not engaging in the task, and that's not as effective. Whereas with the brain-computer interface, nothing will happen unless we detect changes in the brain activity first. So your brain is primed then to have the most impact with a stroke rehabilitation technology like that. And we have a lot of evidence to suggest that this is better. So this is a study done a few years ago showing the outcomes for different feedback therapies and different technologies, and it's shown that brain-computer interfaces actually provide the most benefit, simply because it's very active. You have to engage the brain first, so that's another benefit of brain-computer interfaces. And then there is this idea that the window of opportunities in the first 3 to 6 months following stroke, and then your ability to recover after that is limited. But there is evidence to suggest that if you continue with that and keep engaging over time, then you will still have an impact and still be recovering some lost brain function. So that's quite important, I think, and my own personal experience with that. My wife had a stroke in 2014, lost left side activity, and over a number of years she kept engaging, and slowly but surely some of the function that we thought was never going to come back has come back. So important to keep those repetitions up if you've had a stroke. So we're going to talk now about another study that we've been doing with people who have brain injuries. In a brain injury situation, a person might come through a coma. They could fully recover, but they also could end up in a condition known as disorders of consciousness, where you could be in a UWS state, which is an unresponsive wakefulness state, where you're assumed to be awake but completely unaware of your environment. Minimally conscious state is where you're awake and there's some evidence that you have awareness or consciousness, but that is fluctuating. And then locked in syndrome is where you're completely aware and completely awake, but just not able to move because you've got certain damage to the lower parts of the brain. And so there's a lot of uncertainty when we try to estimate how much awareness or consciousness a person has in these conditions, because the person cannot overtly respond to command or questions reliably. And sometimes we misdiagnose people because they're not able to overtly respond. And we use standard methods like this, like the Coma Recovery Scale Revised or the Wessex Head Index measurement. And these are very kind of subjective scales where a speech and language therapist or the multidisciplinary team will ask the person to move their head or shake maracas around their head or ask them to do a body blink or a hand movement. And sometimes if that's not consistent, then they would assume the person's not able to respond and can lead to misdiagnosis, whereas a brain-computer interface is completely movement independent. So if you ask the person to imagine movement, even if they can't move, they can still try to engage the brain. And so what we've been doing is testing whether this can happen. So we put a headset on, we ask people to, every time you hear a beep, imagine that you're lifting your right hand or left hand. And we do that a number of times. Then we say every time you hear a beep, try to imagine that you're lifting your feet. And we do that a number of times, repetitively, maybe get up to 90 repetitions. And then we look then to see, is there a difference between the feet versus the hand response in this person that's not able to respond? And if it is, then we move them on to another set of sessions where they do that similar thing. So they're imagining movement, could be lifting a weight with the right hand, lifting a weight with the left hand, and they're getting this feedback using the auditory feedback, as I've explained earlier. And what we're trying to see is, do they engage over multiple sessions? Can they get better at doing this over multiple sessions? And eventually we get to a point where we can ask closed questions. So we sit down with a family member and we ask them the appropriate yes/no responses for this particular person. We split the questions up into biographical awareness, situational awareness, abstract reasoning, numbers and letters. once we've determined the right answers for that person, we ask the family member to read the questions aloud. We record the family member when they're reading them aloud, and then we play them back to the participant. And remember, they've already done 7 or 8 sessions where they've learned to modulate brain activity. And so we say, imagine right arm movement for yes or left arm movement for no. And then we want to see, and then that's repetitive as well, the way I explained it. And so we've 42 participants done in this scenario now. So 42 people with brain injuries. We've travelled around the country, Ireland, England, going to various hospitals and various people's homes. So of those 42, we had 14 UWS who showed, 8 of whom showed signs of awareness in the initial session. So that means 14 people that are assumed to be completely unaware of their environment were able to move to the next sessions. 8 of those were able to move to the next sessions. 13 of the MCS and 10 of the LIS. And here are the results in general. So what we're looking at is, what was their performance in the brain-computer interface, and what was their performance on the standard tests. So in the standard behavioural tests, the UWS showed very low scores, the MCS a little bit higher, and then the LIS higher again. Whereas with the brain-computer interface, we're not seeing much difference between UWS and MCS, which indicates maybe that the UWS are able to modulate brain activity just as good as MCS and nearly as good as LAS. So I know this is a little bit hard to explain, but what we're seeing is, in general, with brain-computer interface, we don't see as many differences because it's not a behavioural response that's required to diagnose the patient. It's just a brain modulation. We also see in the questions that MCS respond a little bit better than UWS, LAS better again, and then able-bodied. Yes?
Excuse me, you're talking about deviations. What does some of them mean?
So
I'm sorry, because it's completely going over my head. No short words.
yeah, so UWS is this one, right? Unresponsible wakefulness syndrome. So this is where all right, apologies. Yeah, so UWS is where a person is assumed to be completely unaware or has no levels of consciousness, maybe awake, whereas MCS is minimally conscious state. That's where people have awareness, but that awareness is quite unclear and it fluctuates. And then LIS, which is locked-in syndrome, is where a person is, well, in locked-in syndrome, a person's assumed to maybe cognitively fully intact, but just cannot move. They're completely paralyzed, but they're assumed to be fully functional. And so what we're seeing is that our results in terms of the brain-computer interface are correlated with the level of severity, but less so than the standard clinical tests. So brain-computer interfaces are definitely adding value. We couldn't say that, right? We can definitely say that we can enable somebody to communicate with this technology just yet. We're just assessing whether a person was able to respond more reliably to the biographical questions versus the logical questions and so on, just to see if there's a profile there that we can determine. Sorry, go ahead.
Just a quick question. Do you know the signals from a part of the body, how long does that take to transfer to the brain?
Whenever you're imagining,
Yeah.
well, I'll answer that a different way. So
Yeah.
if you're responding to a stimulus, so say you want to push a button after a stimulus appears on the screen, that could take 700 to 800 milliseconds, right? Or which is maybe 0.8 of a second, right? If we present the stimulus on the screen and we look at the brain response in response to that stimulus, that could happen within 200 or 300 milliseconds, so 0.3 of a second.
Yeah.
So there is brain-computer interfaces that show that you could speed up the reaction time. So rather than waiting, if you're driving down the road and you see an obstacle in front of you and you have to brake hard, so it takes a little while to process the scene and then send commands to your leg. So that could happen over a second. Whereas if I just push the brake with the brain-computer interface as soon as I respond, I could do that in 300 milliseconds, so you could actually make the whole scenario safer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had a feeling you were going to say it would be seconds myself because it does come out like very quickly. Because I think your brain knows what it's going to say before you actually say it as well. It does too.
Yeah, well, there's lots of, they're called potentials or evoked potentials that happen in response to stimulus. But another scenario, if I'm asked a number of questions and I have to push a button to answer them, and I realize I pushed the wrong button, there'll be this response in the brain that happens 200 milliseconds after the error occurs, and it'll take you about a second to realize you made an error. But there's early neural correlates of things happening before they become consciously aware, for sure. Yeah. Okay, so I hope that was understandable in terms of the setup there. We also show that at the start of the trial, the patients engage in the brain activity may be a little bit unusual for UWS, but over the course of training, then this starts to get more focused on the areas that we would expect to focus on and the motor cortex. So the able-bodied is always in the right area. The LIS kind of changes towards the end. And then some of the earlier MCS and UWS less so, but eventually it gets there. We can also show that over time people get better. So I'm not going to explain this in detail, but basically the accuracy is going up in general over time for this participant. And there is this thing around Erickson's 10,000 hours. If we want to become professionals or experts at a particular motor task, the more time we put in, the more likely we are to do that. So with brain-computer interfaces, we might get people to do 10 sessions, and that can be quite difficult, to get even a student in the lab to concentrate for 10 one-hour sessions. But I think, there's a necessity to do a lot more to try and, engage the brain in a way that will be able to enable you to control brain-computer interfaces. So that's why we create these games and so on. But if you had an idea for an application that really made me and you get up in the morning, put on a headset, and train for an hour, I think you'd be very rich. So I'm up for all ideas there, right?
Yeah.
But again, I think this idea of engaging and adopting these technologies and being very, very focused on it is important. So we've also done a study where we added in this auditory evoked potential. So rather than just using the motor imagery, we play sounds, and then there's deviant sounds. And what we're saying, we wanted to see that the person who has not responded in any way because they've got a brain injury had different responses to the various sounds. And this is another way of assessing if a person is aware or not. And what we've shown basically is that, based on the level of injury or diagnosis, then people with UWS, which is the worst situation for anybody, have a longer latency in their evoked responses from the auditory stimulus, and they also have lower accuracy. And then as we go to MCS and LIS, accuracy increases and the latency comes down. So these are correlated in this way. And this is Owen, and this is one of our participants, who's one of our first participants in this study, and his father was interviewed by the Nuffield Council on Bioethics, and that's just a quote saying that they really thought that Owen was benefiting from participating in the study because he was engaged in research, and they really took a lot out of this, and so I think participation is really good, and we really appreciate that. Okay, so I'm not going to spend too long on that, but this is the study that we're doing. It's still ongoing, so we've got 15 hospitals involved. We're recruiting from various sites, and Walton's there as well in Liverpool, yeah. So we're trying to finish this study this year. So if you know anybody or anybody that might be interested in getting involved in this, we're happy to try and we send people around and they stay in hotels for 2 or 3 weeks in a region, and we try and get 2 or 3 patients, 10 sessions done in those 3 weeks. It's not easy in terms of logistics, but it's a very important study, I think. So we've also looked at this study and what impact it has on families who participate with us, because whenever we recruit these participants, the participant doesn't actively consent. It's the family member that consents for them. and it's the family member that facilitates access, and it's the family member that tells us everything about the participant. And so we wanted to see what their experience was, and how we could, how this technology could have an impact beyond, it being used in the home and so on. And so it was quite interesting. We did interviews and we did video diaries of the families whilst they were participating with the study. And we looked at these types of themes that came out, and there was hopefulness, encouragement, but there's also disappointment when somebody doesn't do so well. And so what we really want to do is assess that wider impact on the families and patients. And so, you might think this technology is difficult to get going with, but it's not really. We've got, I've got a headset right here in my pocket, and I've another one in my bag, so papers as well. So this is an EEG headset that folds and moves its way around the head. You can have a look at that after. And so these technologies have become more and more accessible and can be delivered to people at very low costs. And I think that's what one of the aspirations of this company, which I founded, is to drive down the cost of these technologies, make them more accessible, make them more reliable, and try and get as many people using it as possible. Because the data is one thing in terms of trying to get these technologies better. We need more data, just as you're probably aware with language models and ChatGPT and vision-based AI at the minute. It's all about big data sets to make these reliable, and we just don't have that in brain-computer interface as well. So these technologies are wireless. They can be used in the home, and they're very easy to deploy. From the lab to the home or at hospitals, out of the lab, I think is very important to try and really get these technologies over the line. And there are a lot of applications associated with this, not just medical, not just assistive technologies, but other areas that can help or can be helped by enabling people to self-regulate their brain activity for cognitive rehabilitation and post-traumatic stress disorder, for example, in other areas, gaming, and then workplace well-being and so on. And there's a lot of other conditions that I haven't talked about here that could benefit from neurotechnologies in general. And there is a lot of kind of standard, following the law of accelerated returns, where these technologies are becoming more accessible, cheaper, and there are more and more user groups adopting them over time. And in the UK, there's a lot of interest in the technology, especially around regulation and make sure these technologies are delivered safely and that we don't have privacy concerns and people are comfortable with how their data might be used and so on. So we have to make sure that everything's done ethically and people in general are the main beneficiaries of the technology. I'll just say a little bit about the Institute for the Augmented Human, where I'm now for 2 years at the University of Bath. So we've kind of focused on various technologies. Neurotechnology obviously is my area, but also VR and augmented reality, exoskeleton prosthetics, virtual digital assistants, and wearable devices. So these are all technologies that could improve human performance in health, but also in sport, possibly in defence and in the workforce. And we want to bring those together. We've got 90 academic members in the Institute all working across these technologies, and we're developing this innovation ecosystem. So we're not just going to be writing papers and then saying, well, that's it, done. We want to make sure that they're tried with the end users, that we know exactly what the end users want. So we do a lot of patient and public involvement and research right throughout the ecosystem. And then hopefully that we can regulate these technologies and make sure they're deployed, and then find the funding or spin out the companies or whatever to get them out to the people that we want. So that's our main focus. Thanks to everyone who's been involved in this and our funders. And thank you for listening, and thanks for